Liam asked me to speak a little bit about how you engage the public, both in encouraging them into your space, but also when you have people that are visiting your pop-up exhibition or visiting your pop-up museum, what to do with them when they're in the door, basically. So we'll take a look at a few things there. But I'm lucky in that the Butler Gallery mission statement, and I'll read it out, it's on the slide here, it says, the Butler Gallery programmes contemporary work of local, national and international visual artists in a living way through exhibition, collection and education projects for the benefit of the widest possible audience. The gallery is committed to playing a central role locally and nationally in developing and advocating the visual arts through its programme and associated activities. So, as the education curator, I'm delighted and very lucky that that our education programming and that our programmes that encourage participation from the local and national community is enshrined in our mission statement, and that's taken very seriously by the gallery. So I think engagement is at the heart of what we do, and it stands to reason because it is through that engagement that we get our visitors in. And so I think that'll be a useful thing to bear in mind when you do have a fantastic exhibition of objects or art or whatever it is, or local history, whatever it is that you decide will be your exhibition. You need to engage with people to ensure that people are seeing what it is that you've spent so much time and effort on. And over the next 20 minutes, I'm going to hopefully cover the tour experience and how it is that you can engage a group. I'll also look a little bit at opportunities for extended engagement, working with local expertise, that building a bridge that Jenny mentioned just there now between experts in your local community. And I'll look at some one-off event ideas as well, programming events. But before we get into any of that, I want to ask you if you can remember your first experience of a tour, be it in an art gallery or a museum. Just take a second and have a little think. Can anybody remember their first tour experience? I see a nodding head in the second row there. Would you like to share it?
Well, it was to the Dead Zoo in Dublin.
Okay.
When I was, 4 or 5 with my granny.
And was it a positive experience?
Oh yeah.
Uh-huh. So you were interested.
Yeah.
Yeah. And excited.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's at the key of it, is if there may be other people who have had similarly positive experiences where you leave inspired and excited and really enthused by what you've seen. But there may also be people who are here, and unfortunately I have to count myself as one of them. My first experience, or the first one that I can recall, was a terribly boring experience. And I was a small child and part of a big group that was being talked at by the tour guide, and it lasted an interminable length, which I'm sure was probably only about 20 minutes, but as a small child with sore legs, it seemed to go on forever. And so I think if you think about what the experience is going to be like, not only for you who might be giving the tour, but for those people who are in front of you, and how you can best engage them. So that's why I've and you'll excuse the little pun on my slide, I was very proud of that. But how can we ensure that we are going to be truly engaging? In the Butler Gallery, we take a discussion-based approach. So essentially, and it seems like it's a very obvious idea, none of this is rocket science, and I'll hold my hands up to that right away. But we hope that when visitors come into the gallery, that their voices will be heard as much as my voice if I'm facilitating a tour. So while of course we want to inspire and give information so that people have learned something by the end of their visit, but I also want to hear what it is that they think about the art that we're exhibiting, and perhaps experiences that they can share with us. And so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on this idea, and we use a kind of to break it down into the mechanics of it, we use a kind of a 4-step approach. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these as I go through. And what I'm going to do, in the slide here and in the following 4 slides, you can see that this work by this Donal O'Driscoll painting is part of the Butler Gallery collection, and I'm essentially kind of using that as an example of maybe how you might approach these 4 different stages. So first of all, observation seems completely obvious, but sometimes isn't as obvious. You need to allow for people to have plenty of time to really get a good look at what it is that you're going to be talking about. And this is particularly relevant if you are potentially you might be exhibiting objects of interest from a local history perspective. These may be in a cabinet or some sort of a case. You need to make sure that everyone has had the opportunity to really get a good look at it before you start talking about it, or people really won't be engaged in this. So I would always advise that you begin with a bit of quiet time where people can move around, get a good look, maybe see things from different angles as well, and give them just a bit of time to settle in and get comfortable. Once people are kind of static, just ensure that as many people in the group, and hopefully all of the people in the group, have an unrestricted view of what it is that you're talking about. We often use seating in our tours. We have these portable little stools, and again, if we're talking about a budget, I have my heart set on these amazing museum stools that they use in museums and galleries around the place, but unfortunately we didn't have the budget for that. So we have these portable little, I think they're fishing stools, fold out little things, and they're very handy, but people can be quite comfortable then after they've observed. And description does exactly what it says on the tin, really. So in particular, if you're exhibiting unusual objects, or like in the Butler Gallery, where most of our exhibitions are contemporary art, people can feel a little bit on the back foot sometimes when it comes to contemporary art. But a very good way of starting is to literally just do that and ask people to describe what it is that they see, so that they're eventually kind of building up a reading of what it is that they're looking at. So this is quite a straightforward work, but I might simply ask, what are the figures in the painting doing? Describe the colour scheme. Let's take a look at the brush strokes that the artist has used, or talk a little bit about materials and that kind of thing. So essentially we're looking at the formal properties of the object or the work here. So you could touch on line and shape, material, colour, all of this kind of thing. And then as people are describing what it is that they see, you as a facilitator are kind of repeating that back to the group to ensure that everybody is heard, and you're gradually building a kind of a collaborative view of what it is that you're looking at. This can work very, very well as well for not only art objects, but it can also work for objects of historical importance as well. By asking people to look for the detail and to describe what it is that they're seeing, you can then move very nicely into the interpretation cycle of the discussion, which again you've taken your visual inventory, and the interpretation then leads for a deeper kind of engagement with what it is, with the object or the artwork that you're looking at. And you want to encourage, especially when it's an art object that you're talking about, you want to encourage a real breadth and variety of interpretation. So you're really allowing people's voices to be heard here. And essentially you're asking the questions of people to try and elicit responses that can then deepen the conversation. What I tend to do, I especially if it's an exhibition or an artist whose work I'm particularly interested in, I tend to limit myself. I give myself a limit of 3 or 4 pieces of art historical information per object during a discussion. Because if I limit myself to 3 or 4 pieces of information, it's not going to be my voice yammering on the entire time. We'll have discussion and collaboration, but people will still leave having learnt some new information as well. So essentially, the interpretation will assign meaning to the various different things that people have described. So you might ask about time and place. So if a particular work was made at a very specific time, you might ask about this, this time in history, or like this painting, what season is suggested by this scene. You might, if you're talking about an art object, you might focus on narrative at this point. So what is implied by the two figures that are walking in this painting, or by the way that they're interacting. You might discuss mood, what do people feel when they're looking at a particular work, that kind of thing. And this is a really nice point where you can introduce some biographical information about the artist, and speak a little bit about the artist's intention as well. If you're talking about a historical object, the social context of that object could be brought up at this point. So it might even be a coin that's associated with a particular period in history, and you could ask people what their impressions perhaps of that period are, and then go on to discuss a little bit more information about that. And then finally, connection. And this is a really enjoyable part that kind of wraps everything up. So essentially, we're at this stage, the facilitator is encouraging the members of the group to connect with their own life experiences and memories, and connect that with whatever you're discussing, whether it be an historical object or a piece of art either. So simple questions, and people always love to give answers to these questions because they feel as though perhaps they're a little bit less intimidating. Everybody can provide an opinion on whether they find a piece of work interesting, do they like the work. Even questions like, does this look like the Ireland of today, or does it look like it's maybe some time ago? And then if an example I would use for this particular painting is, where's your favourite place to take a walk? Again, you're engaging people at a very personal level, and people are very often very willing to share their experiences. And just some quick facilitation tips here. So you want to make sure that you're making eye contact with all of the members of the group. Again, a very obvious one. And when visitors do offer an observation or a response to a question that you've asked them, very important to validate this response, and never kind of... there are ways around correcting somebody that don't involve telling somebody that they're wrong or that they're incorrect. So, your tour experience should never involve scolding or chastising, but always a kind of a validation, because it can be intimidating for people who are not familiar with a museum or a gallery setting, and even very often for those who might visit art exhibitions or museums quite frequently, to participate in a discussion during a tour like this. Some people may find it intimidating, even though you don't realise it, so it's nice to kind of give that sort of validation for people and thank them for their response. I like to use visitors' names, so when we have groups come into the Butler Gallery, we use name tags, and that way it can be really more organic when you're inviting people to contribute. If, say, for example, you're looking at 4 objects throughout your tour, and you're on your 3rd object, and a discussion happens that's reminiscent of something that came up in the first room, you can refer back by name to people and the contributions that they've made. It's just a simple thing, but it can be helpful. I've put here perform. Don't be afraid to be light-hearted, that's meant to say, and humorous. And again, it's that idea that it should be a fun experience. People are there as it's entertainment, and they want to be inspired. So don't be afraid to give a bit of a performance. And if the objects or artifacts that you're exhibiting can't be touched, particularly for children and very often for adults, it can be very helpful to explain why this is the case. I always say when we have children in the gallery that no matter how well we wash our hands, there are natural oils on our fingers and on our hands that can damage a work of art in ways that we can't even see. So that's why it's very important not to touch something. And generally, if you give people a reason, they'll listen to you more than maybe a little sign in the corner that says "Don't touch." So Jenny spoke a little bit about child facilitator ratios, and these are some suggested ratios. These are generally what we try and tend to use in the gallery. If we have pupils coming from a school or a youth group, we tend to try and stick to these ratios. So you can see there it varies depending on age. So if a school is coming with 30 13-year-olds, we would generally ask that there are 2 teachers or a teacher and a parent that accompany them. And these are adults in addition to the facilitator of the tour. So you want the facilitator to really be able to focus on the engagement as part of the tour, rather than having to look after the needs of the group, keeping people together, and that kind of thing. So that's why this is important. And I often find where there are teachers coming with a school, great to encourage the accompanying adults to really participate in the discussion, because if the accompanying adults are more engaged, then it's just going to help with the overall atmosphere. Won't labour on this point, as Jenny already mentioned it, but the Heritage Council and the Arts Council, I have links here to the child protection pages on both, and they both offer some really good guidelines there. It is extremely important, as Jenny mentioned, to have a read and to have something prepared. Just to speak a little bit about extended engagement, these are 3 programmes that run throughout schools. The Butler Gallery Artist in Residence runs throughout primary schools all over Kilkenny City and County. The National Craft Council of Ireland Craft End programme and the Heritage in School scheme both run throughout the country. And this is where an artist or a maker, a craft maker, will spend an extended period of time in engagement with a primary school or a secondary school class. And so they may be meeting with them over 3 or 4 weeks to follow a particular line of work. Very often in the Butler Gallery with our Artist in Residence programme, the artists that go out at a particular period of time in the year, they spend 12 contact hours with a class in a primary school responding to the exhibition that the Butler Gallery is exhibiting at the time. So it's a really special thing because it's a very extended engagement, and students really get into it, and teachers can also learn new skills and ways of facilitating art in the classroom as well. And there are ways in which the budget for these things, and I'm imagining that the budget for your pop-up spaces will be tight, but there are ways of doing a similar kind of thing on a smaller budget. Another way in which we offer extended engagement is in a 3-part visit. So we might start where the group that we're going to be working with, whether it be a school group or a community group, we go to them first. We start where it is geographically, where they're comfortable, and we might go out and give a small introduction about what it is that they're going to see when they come and visit our exhibition. Then the second part happens when the group come to the exhibition space. They will visit and view and have a tour similar to what we discussed. And this will be followed then by a creative workshop based on their visit. This could either take place in their community setting, or it could take place at your exhibition site where it's possible to do so. You may not have the space for that, and in that case it can be nice if you want to go back out into the community centre again and facilitate, once again, kind of where they're very comfortable. Working with an artist can be a really fantastic thing if you can afford to. Artists can engage visitors in creative responses in a way that I will count myself in this as a non-artist cannot sometimes, so it can be a really fantastic thing when you can afford to work with an artist. And if you have a bit of a budget to do this, you might wish to work with an artist maybe on a few Saturdays in a row, and they might come in. You could have a drop-in workshop or a family workshop where people create creative responses to your exhibition. Visual Artists Ireland is an organisation that can offer you a lot of advice on recruitment and guidelines for payment for facilitating artists as well. And they have a national bulletin that goes out on a regular basis where you could potentially recruit for people to work with here. And then when it comes down to programming one-off events, as Jenny mentioned, look for the experts in your community. So connect with artists who might be living in your community. Connect with the local historians. There may be clubs or societies in your locality that have particular interests. I know here in Kilkenny there's the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, they're very engaged. There may be local storytellers. And then think about what it is that's unique about your collection of objects and artefacts. So think about the kind of complementary events that can really sell this uniqueness. So, for example, if it's historical objects that might involve objects that could have been used potentially in kitchens or for eating or drinking, you might decide to have a food or a drink tasting event. Or you may have reminiscence events for older adults who wish to come to your exhibition and share their stories and their memories of these kind of objects. Similarly, you could do this kind of, it really works for any object, but you have to focus in on what's unique. Timing is everything. The reason I say this very quickly is because you're going to attract a different audience at different times of the day, very simply. Particularly during the winter time, we find that older adults much prefer events that happen mid-morning, because it's easier perhaps if they have to drive a long way or if they're coming from rural areas. Mid-morning is a really good time. Then of course the after work crowd, you have to think about that kind of thing too. You could offer lunchtime events, and never underestimate the attraction of a cup of tea and some refreshments. If you can offer them, I would highly advise it. And I think that's it. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.